Hey guys, look what I found at the art store. This is a new packaging of hot press 100% cotton watercolor paper, and it's in a block. Canson is now making cotton paper instead of cellulose. I've never liked their cellulose paper. And because the Arches hot press watercolor paper is not in Korea, at least I can't find it, and that's my favorite, I went ahead and bought this, and I'm going to be evaluating this paper off of 10 points that I think is essential for a quality watercolor paper to have. And if you're going to be buying this watercolor paper, I think you should stick around to the end because I do give some really important insights on the pros and the cons. Okay, before we talk about the paper, we actually have to talk about the products we're using with it because of the synergy. I'm using a 2-inch wide Princeton Neptune brush. The brand name doesn't matter. You just need a wide brush for putting down an even sheen on the paper. That would prevent puddles from happening and other areas from drying too quickly by having this even sheen. I'm also using 5 professional paints from 3 professional brands. And the brands are Daniel Smith, M. Graham, and Winsor Newton. But the only pigment that you need to know about is the M. Graham Phthalo Green, and I will be talking about that one later. The last item of importance is the Sennelier masking fluid, and I will stress right now that I've never had a problem with this masking fluid before, and so if you think that's foreshadowing, perhaps it is. Okay, so let's start painting. And criteria number 1 is, can the paper take a lot of wet in wet? So you already saw me put down an even sheen of water on the paper, and now I'm using my pre-mixed paints to drop into that sheen. I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes or so just dropping in a little touch here, a little pigment there, and I'm just kind of letting the paper take care of itself. I'm not pushing the paints around with my brush at all. So this is the first layer, it's wet and wet, and I'm really liking the effect. After about 5 minutes, I pick up the watercolor block, I'm moving it around, and I'm trying to distribute that sheen of watercolor on the surface just to get those pigments distributed evenly. And you can see that there is a little bit of buckle in the surface of that paper. This brings us to criteria number 2. Is there going to be a buckle? How much is it going to be? Well, most watercolor papers are going to buckle a little bit, and you can see this is rippling, it's not really buckling. I've only been painting 5 minutes. Is this buckle going to continue? Is it going to loosen the glues on the side? And will the paper eventually dry flat at the end of the painting? So we'll have to answer these questions at the end. I've now been painting about 10 minutes. And the criteria number 3 is, can I lift the color in this wet and wet process? So I'm taking a tissue and dabbing in some of the tree area to get a bokeh effect. Now, before I told you about the M. Graham Phthalo Green, this particular pigment is very staining. But you can see as I'm dabbing in that area, I'm dabbing out a lot of that M. Graham, which should be staining the canvas, but it's not. So I'm realizing because of the high level of water still on the canvas, I am able to lift out a lot of the pigment, even the highly staining ones. And this is a great point because not all papers can lift like this one. I'm now 13 minutes into the painting process, and I'm starting to add in some other layers of color. So I'm wondering, how well can I lay in these multiple layers of color? Well, for the next hour and 30 minutes, I'm doing kind of a process painting. I drop a little color here, some little color there, painting leaves, stems, trunks, whatever. Obviously, the paper is going to be drying during this time. So sometimes when I put in some leaves, I have to spritz a little water on that, make those colors flow again, and then I will drop in some more paints. And this is pretty much the process that I'm doing for the next hour and 30 minutes. Criteria number 5 is, can we remove the masking easily? So let me just stress that I used the hair dryer to dry the paper. I didn't use high heat, and I didn't concentrate the airflow on any one area. Time to remove the masking, and guess what? I can't. I even tried scrubbing on the paper, and I did get some up, but there is a lot of masking still in that paper, which is, I've never seen this before. So now the pebbly areas in the ground, yeah, that'll be fine. But the area on the back of the deer and on the forehead, it looks pretty bad. So this brings us to point number 6. Can we dab and retouch? Dab and retouch means how I can dab in color here and put in detail there. So you see me putting in a bit of gouache on the cheek to get a lighter effect. I'm trying to build up some color on the neck and put in some wrinkles. Having a little problem with that wrinkle, but I've noticed that there is a tooth on this paper compared with other hot press watercolor papers. This one definitely has a bit of a tooth, so it's not as smooth as other papers. Not to mention that I'm painting only a 3-inch wide deer. So yeah, dab and retouch is possible, but probably not as easily done as on other hot press watercolor papers. This brings us to criteria number 7. Can we lift wet in dry? We already know that we can lift wet in wet. We already know that. So as I was painting this back leg, I applied too much pigment. I didn't like it. So I just took my tissue, dabbed it up, and then I was able to just drop in the amount of pigment that I wanted. And I noticed this in other areas. As long as the paint hadn't settled into the paper yet, then I was able to lift it quite easily. So wet in dry and wet in wet, they're both beautiful possibilities for this paper. Criteria number 8 is about, can we remove the tape and not have any kind of interaction with the paper or cause paper tear? Well, I do regret not putting any tape on this particular painting because there is a tooth and I could expect some kind of interaction. But here's an example of when the tape and the paper did have some kind of interaction. This is my watercolor turkey that I painted. For some reason, my paper tape got really sticky during the painting process. I never used the paper tape after that, but I had to remove the paper tape using high heat from my hairdryer. And it was just surprising, and so because of the tooth on this paper, there probably could be some kind of interaction. I don't know what it would be, but I do need to test this out. Criteria 2 was about paper buckle during the wet and wet process, which brings us to criteria number 9. Is there paper buckle at the end of the painting when everything is dry? Well, you are looking at a screen snap right now, and really there is relatively no paper buckle whatsoever. This is really impressive. What's also impressive is I took the palette knife and I was cutting through the glues that held the paper to the block, and I can say that 100% of the glue was still intact. I have never seen this before, not even in the more professional brands, and I am completely impressed with this feature of this paper. And now for criteria number 10. Can we lift paint that has dried and get back to the original color of the paper? Well, I have successfully done this before with other watercolor papers, and of course using the non-staining paints. The technique is to dampen the area, dab it with a tissue, dampen the area, dab it with a tissue, maybe another time or two, and the color will pretty much lift off of the paper. However, I'm finding with this particular paper, once the paint has settled into the fibers of that surface, there is going to be a stain. And this means even with a non-staining paint like green gold, I can't lift enough out to say that I have got back to the original color of the paper. So it's just a FYI, it's not a game changer, just something to be aware of. Okay, so I've identified what I think are 5 strengths and 5 weaknesses for this particular paper. I would say for the strengths, the wet and wet process was absolutely beautiful. I could keep an even sheen on that paper for a long time, drop in the paints, move them around. That was wonderful. Number 2 was I was able to get multiple layers. Number 3 is while I was painting in that wet layer, I could easily lift paints out, even the staining ones, as long as they hadn't dried yet. Number 4, and this is the best, absolutely the best, there was almost no buckle to this paper, which is amazing. And number 5, the glue stayed 100% in contact with the block throughout my entire 3 hours of painting. And when I say 3 hours, 1 hour and 45 minutes was the wet and wet process. So I am totally amazed with these 5 points. And now for the drawbacks. The first one is I felt that there was a texture on the paper. So as I was painting the deer particularly, I kept thinking there's a texture here and I'm not getting the detail that I'm used to. So finally I got up and I felt of my other hot press watercolor papers, and sure enough, this paper has a tooth. So for the artist who paints with cold press or rough paper, they aren't going to feel a thing, I don't think. But the people who are painting with hot press, they want that detail, they want that smooth surface. This could be a concern. Number 2 is, yes, the paints do move very easily on the paper, but I find also that when you're painting a second layer and the first layer is dry, it is easy to activate the colors on that first layer. Which brings us to number 3. Once the colors have dried into that surface, they don't lift out, but they do lift. Okay, so these are just minor points, but number 4 is absolutely major, and this has to do with the masking fluid. The reason people use masking fluid is so they can retain the white. They're not going to want speckles and all kinds of discoloration in the area that they're wanting to retain white. This is serious. And I feel that it's the masking fluid that's influencing drawback number 5, which I haven't even mentioned yet. This is also serious. I used my palette knife and I removed the paper from the watercolor block. Underneath, the paper underneath was stained. I turned my painting over and I had actual stain marks where the paint had seeped through. As I was looking at these stain marks, it seemed to be that some of the areas where I put masking, not all the areas, but some of the areas where I put masking, they caused a leak of the paints to actually seep through the paper. Now, I don't understand this because I didn't use that much masking and I've never had this before. But anyway, this is my experience. So guys, if anybody has had this kind of a problem with the masking fluid, please make a comment below. I really would like to understand this. Well, this is my first experience using the Canson Heritage Hot Press 100% Cotton Watercolor Paper Block. And I'm really glad you stuck around to the end. If you have comments, please make them below. I will also attach a couple of other watercolor paper reviews that I've given if you're interested. And I wish you a happy day and happy painting.